All right, so welcome to Bear's Guide to a 5, talking about HDI once again. Very excited about this because we are moving to a brand new unit. We're finally done with agriculture. We're going to move on from that absolute mess. So, starting off with our next unit, we have to revisit HDI. After almost a year of learning about AP Human stuff, we can finally start to contextualize and understand HDI a little bit more, and we actually have some ideas of what makes the HDI instead of just reciting things. So the question we have to ask ourselves, the very beginning question is, what are the three components of HDI? HDI, the Human Development Index, we measure three things to see how developed a country is. We look at the standard of living, the life expectancy, and the access to knowledge. And this HDI number ranges from 0 to 1, and the closer you are to 1, the more developed you are. And of course, as we look at the world, we can see a pretty basic trend where the more developed countries are and the low developing countries are. Now, we've talked a lot about different types of countries. We've talked about developing, high developing, developed, so on and so forth. But we're really going to dig deep in what makes them a developed country or a developing country. Now, if you look at this chart, once again, just looking at the major regions of HDI, we see that places like North America, Europe, South Pacific, these are the regions that are more developed in the world, while places like Russia, Latin America, East Asia are our high developing regions. And then moving along down a little bit further, you get to South Asia, and then at the bottom, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is going to have a majority of our developing nations. But by no means does this make the entire region developing or developed, because obviously countries are different. And then even inside countries, you have really developed areas and you have developing areas in countries. These are just generalizations, general trends that we can count on to use, say if we were writing an FRQ or if we're answering some type of multiple choice question. Now, let's talk about what makes HDI. The first one is productivity, money. Now, I'm going to throw a lot of acronyms at you and a whole lot of information. This is probably the most confusing thing on this video, but don't get too caught up in all the different acronyms and technicalities of each thing. Just know that these are ways that we measure, and I would definitely recommend knowing gross domestic product, GDP. This says, by definition, the value of the outputs of goods and services, if they are nationals or foreigners, does not account for the money that leaves and enters the country. Essentially, all the money that is made inside of the country is gross domestic product. And it doesn't matter if it's made by companies owned by citizens of that country, or if it's by companies from foreign countries in that country. If it's made in that country, the money is made in that country, it counts as gross domestic product, or GDP. The next one is gross national product. By definition, it says, includes the earnings from all assets owned by residents inside and outside of the country. And we are omitting the earnings of foreigners living in the country. So now we're looking at the country as a whole. We're using the money that's made by residents inside the country. We're looking at other countries in the world that have that country's residents or companies, and they count that as the money. But if a foreign country has investments in a country, we do not count that one. Here's a better example. You have country A, and in country A, we're going to count all the people of country A and their money. And then we have country B, C, and D. But in countries B, C, and D, country A has invested and created companies in B, C, and D. It's going to count those companies in countries B, C, and D that belong to country A. But countries B, C, and D also have money in country A. We're not going to count that. Okay, then we move on to gross national income. By definition, measures income earned by residents, including income from investments that flow back into the country. So this is going to count money that's made in other countries that go back to the country. That's essentially it. So very confusing acronyms. Just understand that each one of these just measures how much a country is made, and there's small technicalities that kind of differentiate whether we're going to count foreign investment or not. But what to take away from this is the idea of GDP, GNP, GNI per capita. Per capita means that we're going to take whatever measurement and divide it by the amount of people in a country. And why would we do that? So we can't use GDP as a way of describing development. How we use it is per capita, because then we can see how much money an individual person could make in a country. So our GDP per capita in the United States is $50,000 a year. That means everybody has the opportunity, on average, to make $50,000 in the United States in a year. That does not mean that every single person makes $50,000, because we know that some people don't make a lot of money, and we know people that make tons of money. But the fact is that we can find this average, and then we can use that average to compare it to other countries, and then we can figure out who's more developed. But this is just one component to HDI. Now, GDP, or how much money a country makes, is based off of the type of employment that exists. And we break this into sectors. The first sector being primary. This is extracting materials from the earth. This is mining, fishing, drilling, farming, all those very labor-intensive practices that are very tough, bringing materials from the earth. The second sector, secondary sector, is turning those raw materials into finished goods. We're talking manufacturing and factories here, making actual products. Then we get into our high tier of tertiary. These are the service sectors. I'm selling you things now. I'm selling you those made goods. These are stores, this is retail, this is restaurants, all of the service sector stuff. Then you get into quaternary, which is our fourth, which is the manipulation of information. This is research, this is teaching, this is insurance. And then finally you get to quinary. This is our highest level. This is also going to be the smallest amount of employment. These are very high decision-making roles. CEOs are a great example. We're talking about really high-tier people here in money making. And then you have your informal sector, which is people working under the table. This just means that they're working for cash, and that the country cannot record how that money is being made. They can't get tax money from that to invest into the country and infrastructure. It simply means people working for cash. It's like when you get the kid in the neighborhood to mow the lawn and you give them $20, or you hire a tutor and you pay him $30 an hour and you give him cash. That's all the informal sector means. And there's informal sector employment in primary, secondary, tertiary. Don't know so much for quinary. That would be kind of strange. So if we look at the breakdown of jobs globally, obviously primary is going to be the most. We know that the most filled job in the world is agriculture. Second is manufacturing. These are the foundations to the jobs everywhere. And then you have your tertiary jobs, quaternary jobs, and quinary jobs. So what I want you to do now is take some time to think. What types of jobs will developed countries have? What about high developing countries? What about the breakdown of developing countries? I want you to pause the video right now and think to yourself, how many primary jobs are going to be in developed versus developing countries? Secondary, tertiary, so on and so forth. Okay, you should be coming back after pausing the video, and what you should have talked about is the idea that in developed countries, in developing countries, you're going to have a lot of primary jobs, a little bit of secondary jobs, or a lot of secondary jobs, but not as much tertiary and above. And as you shift to more developed countries, we are ditching primary jobs. We're getting rid of secondary jobs. There aren't as many farmers in the developed world. There's not as many factories in the developed world. That stuff is gone to other places. And it's stuff that we have seen. We're just putting real words to it now. All right, moving on from productivity for HDI. Let's jump into health. This is where it gets a lot easier. We've talked about this concept before of how do we measure health for a country. And the best way is life expectancy. How long are your people living? And if they're living a long time, that probably means health is good in your country. We also look at fertility rates. We know an indicator of development is dropping those fertility rates. The lower the fertility rates get, closer to that magical 2.1 number, the better off a country will be, because we have a reflection of a lot of other indicators that make the country better. Of course, infant mortality rates are included. If you can lower your infant mortality rates, that brings down your fertility rates. We're increasing life expectancy, because it all comes back to the idea of access to healthcare. We have to dispel the myth that in this world, there are countries that don't have access to healthcare or have never heard of healthcare. We know that people in the developing world don't have access to healthcare. They know it exists. It's a thing. Vaccines are everywhere. Medicines are everywhere. Doctors are everywhere. The real question now for our global world is access to healthcare. We have to make sure that people can get access to basic vaccines, basic medicines, basic care, to then increase the life expectancy, drop those fertility rates, and drop the infant mortality rates. That's what we're really summarizing when we talk about the second component to the HDI, which is access to healthcare. Okay, our final component to HDI is access to knowledge, and we measure that with literacy rates. It's not a very exciting thing on this slide, but that's all it is. We are just looking to make sure more and more people can read, because as more people can read and write, that means they can go into higher sector jobs. They don't have to be the farmer anymore. They can move to their urban area and work in a factory, or they can open up their own small business wherever they're from, in their rural communities or their urban communities. The fact is that when you get more people educated, you progress a country overall. Now, this topic is really interesting. IHDI. It's the inequality adjusted HDI number. So we're measuring the same thing. We're just taking into account the inequality. Because when we look at HDI and we looked at the countries, we notice that the data is presented on a choropleth map. And that can be a little disingenuous when we look at the data, because it gives us broad strokes about what this data shows. And the GDP per capita, for example, in the United States is $50,000. But we know that not everybody in the United States has the opportunity to make $50,000 a year. We know that the life expectancy in the United States is 74 years old, but not everybody lives to 74 years old, because not everybody has the same access to healthcare. And we know that the literacy rate in the United States is somewhere around 90% or something like that, but not everywhere, because of access to knowledge. So this takes into account the inequality and adjusts for that. For the inequality adjusted index, what we're going for, perfection here, is when the HDI and the IHDI are the same. The IHDI can never be above the HDI, because that statistically doesn't make sense. But the greater difference you have between your IHDI and HDI shows that you have a greater inequality in your country. So the goal is to not only have a 1 as your HDI number, but also have your IHDI at 1. So now to wrap things up, what does the world HDI look like? So what I want you to do in your notebooks is to list the top 10 countries with the highest HDI. You're going to have to look this up on the internet and find it. Then I want you to find the US's rank based on its HDI. Then you have to find the United States IHDI number. And finally, in an FRQ style format, discuss why you think the US has the difference in IHDI and HDI that it has. So you should be bringing up topics like health, access to knowledge, and the amount of money we make. That's it. Have these things done before you come to class tomorrow, and have all these notes written down. If you were confused about anything, please feel free to go back in the video and rewatch the stuff. And as always, this is Bear's Guide 205. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you know when new videos come out.